Good morning to you. My name's Dan, and I just want to add my welcome to you today on this Good Friday. It's an interesting phrase, Good Friday. When I think about something good, I think about my footy team having a good win on the weekend. I think about, it's good for Australians to have a long weekend because it's good to catch up with family and friends. When you go to work on Tuesday, somebody will ask you, how was your weekend? And what will you say? Yeah, good, thanks. My kids will try and tell me that eating their body weight in Easter eggs before breakfast is a good idea and it's actually good for them, where I'm probably not as convinced about that. But when we think about something good, we think, this is something that is a positive experience. It resonates favourably with us. Around the AD in 12th century, 13th century, Christians started calling this day the day that we gather to celebrate and remember the horrific condemnation and death of Jesus Christ as good. How did it get to being good? When I read the Gospels, I don't see anything in there that says that this day is good. In Luke, it says that when they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there along with the criminals, one on his right and the other on his left. And Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing." And the way Luke describes it, it's just a matter-of-fact thing. And there, they crucified him, like it was just a throwaway kind of deal. But friends, if you had a list of the way that you would want to die, crucifixion isn't up on top of your list. It was horrific. It was barbaric. There's a terrific book called The Case for Christ, and in it, it unpacks the death and resurrection of Jesus in a courtroom setting, interrogating it. And then Dr. Alexander Methrall describes the anguish and anxiety associated with crucifixion. So a GP describes crucifixion. And he writes, the pain was absolutely unbearable. In fact, it was literally beyond words to describe. They had to invent a new word to describe it. Excruciating. Literally, excruciating means out of the cross. Think of it. They needed to create a new word because there was nothing in the language that describes the anguish caused by crucifixion. So how is this day good? Here is Jesus, innocent, and yet condemned as a criminal. Think of it like this. One of your close friends, 33 years of age, taken in the prime of their life. This close friend of yours impacted thousands and taught about what it was like and what God was like and what life was like. That we're to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. And he didn't just teach it, he lived it. He prayed for his enemies, he loved his enemies. And not only that, people who were born paralyzed and sick and infirmed were brought to Jesus and he healed them. He even raised people from the dead, and he amassed a huge following, but he had no military might. He had a huge influence, but no political power. Oh, and by the way, he was homeless, with no earthly possessions. Did nothing wrong, and yet there they crucified him. Sentenced, condemned, crucified. Now, if you knew that person was close to you, wouldn't you feel a sense of outrage? This is just not fair. How is this right? And the very first thing that I would do was to start pointing the finger and go, who's to blame for this act? This injustice? Who's to blame? And the Gospels point to us to a number of people who are to blame for the crucifixion and the death of Jesus Christ. The first person the Gospels point to is Pilate and the Roman soldiers. The fact that The Romans were the ones who invented crucifixion, but then made it illegal for any Roman to be crucified because of the demeaning, humiliating nature of that form of death. It says a lot about the bloodthirsty nature of Pilate and the Roman soldiers in the way that they executed Jesus. The reason why crucifixion was the worst way to die was because the prisoner would be stripped, publicly humiliated, and then tied to a wooden beam with nails driven through their wrists and their feet, sometimes with a little peg or a stool or something that they could lift themselves up on, so that when the cross was slid into the hole and then hoisted up, the body wouldn't fling forward out of force. On the cross, the prisoner would have to lift themselves on their nails, driven through their feet, in order to breathe, because of the fluid inside of their lungs would suffocate them. And there the person would be helplessly hanging, exposed to intense physical agony, public ridicule, daytime heat, nighttime cold. The torture would last for several days for the crucified person, but for Jesus, the torture commenced earlier. The Roman soldiers had already captured Jesus. They'd already mocked him. They dressed him in purple robes. They twisted together this cruel crown of thorns and rammed it onto his head. They gave him a scepter of reed, like a king's scepter. And they bowed down in front of him and in fake mock worship of the king. They blindfolded him, they spat on him, they struck him on the face, they hit him with sticks, and all the time asking him to identify who it was that hit him. One of our traditions as a family is, maybe we're just gluttons for punishment, I don't know, but we watch the Passion of the Christ on Good Friday and then Risen on Sunday. If you don't have a tradition, get this. It's great. We've done it once. It's our second year, but it's a good tradition to do. And I don't know if the way the soldiers are portrayed in the Passion of the Christ is accurate, where they just seem like they're enjoying. We don't know. The Gospels don't tell us that the soldiers were satisfied in their treatment of Jesus and the way they handled Jesus. They may have just been doing their job. Maybe that's why Jesus says when he was hanging on the cross, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." So maybe the finger needs to not just go to the soldiers, but onto the person who actually handed Jesus over to the soldiers, Pontius Pilate. What about Pilate? In John 19, verse 16, it says, "Finally Pilate handed Jesus over to the soldiers to be crucified. So the soldiers took charge of Jesus." Should blame rest on Pontius Pilate? Pontius Pilate was the Roman procurator, the governor of the Judean region, AD 26 through to AD 36, and he was a bloodthirsty oppressor who put down rebellion brutally in his dominion. There was a Jewish historian, a guy named Josephus, and he wrote about Jesus. Outside of the text of the Bible, this source from Josephus describes this person, Pontius Pilate, and he quotes Herod Agrippa, the King Herod Agrippa I, who describes Pontius Pilate as a man of very inflexible disposition and very merciless, as well as very obstinate. And the Gospel's account of the way that Pilate treats Jesus seems to match that description of Pilate. When Pilate and Jesus were engaging in conversation, he heard and he saw that Jesus was innocent, and he declared 3 times that Jesus was innocent. His wife even received a dream from God to say, "This man is innocent, have nothing to do with him." And yet, the political pressure that Pilate was under to keep peace in Judea was so strong that he squirmed and he weaved away from having to make a decision to satisfy the crowd. Instead, he washes his hands, despite knowing Jesus was innocent, even pleaded with the crowd saying, "What if I just have him severely flogged instead of crucifying him?" And yet the crowd drowns out Pilate and says, crucify him and crucify him. And like the coward that he is, despite knowing his conviction of innocence of Jesus, fearful of losing position and power, he condemns Jesus to the worst possible mode of death. And so maybe Pilate and the soldiers carry some of the blame for the treatment and the death of Jesus. But Jesus said to Pilate this, I don't know if you remember this, John 19 verse 11. Jesus said to Pilate that the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin. So to Jesus, the person who handed him over to Pilate is also culpable and responsible for his death. And we read who that person was. The Jewish priests, Caiaphas, and also the Sanhedrin, but also the Jewish crowd. Remember, the Jewish crowd welcomed Jesus 5 days ago, coming into Jerusalem, riding a colt as an all-conquering king. Now this crowd joins with Caiaphas and the priests in this perfect storm of anger and envy and hatred, cry out for Jesus to be crucified. The Jewish priests hated Jesus. Jesus did not enter the rabbinical pathway, the religious doorway. He didn't climb the rabbinical ladder to be called a rabbi. And yet they called him a rabbi, and Jesus amassed a following. He taught with authority, which led the Pharisees and the Sadducees and all of the religious leaders to this deep insecurity. Jesus didn't care about religious tradition. At every opportunity, he opposed religious tradition. He even challenged the leaders, saying their father isn't God, but the devil. With love, Jesus dismantled religious tradition and instead started gathering those that the world overlooked, those who were marginalized and oppressed. And so because of that, out of envy, they started looking for opportunities to hand Jesus over to Pilate, to hand Jesus over to death. In Mark 15:1, on this day, Good Friday, it says, very early in the morning, the chief priests with their elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin made their plans. So they bound Jesus, they led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. So the Jewish leaders, with Caiaphas as the high priest, surely carry some of the blame of who is responsible for killing Jesus. Because they were the ones who handed Jesus over to the bloodthirsty Romans who carried out the crucifixion. Caiaphas and the Jewish leaders surely carry some of the blame. And maybe you've got that gavel and you're ready to smack it down and go, yes, we know who's guilty. But before that happens, consider one more person. Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Jesus and betrayed the disciples. The Gospels say, right from the start, when introducing Judas, Judas is known as the one who betrays Jesus. And there's this sense in us where we want to say, well, Judas was a traitor right from the start. We want to do this. We want to say that Judas is like a spy planted in the leadership and ready to topple an empire, but that wasn't the case. John chapter 12 and John 13 shows us that Judas was actually a follower and a disciple of Jesus, but he couldn't justify the extravagant spending of finances. In John 12 and 13, Mary used this expensive perfume to anoint Jesus without realizing it in preparation for his crucifixion. And the text in that story has Judas saying, what a waste, what a wicked extravagance. The perfume could have been sold for more than a year's wages and the money given to the poor. But that comment was sick, it was insincere, because John goes on to say that Judas didn't say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. And having witnessed and denounced the extravagant spending of finances from Mary onto Jesus, he then goes to the priests and he says, "What will you give me to hand him over to you?" It was almost like Judas was trying to recoup some of those costs. And then they began, no doubt, to haggle until they hit a bargain and agreed on 30 silver coins, the price of a common slave. Now, attached to blaming Judas, there are some accounts in the Gospels that say that the devil entered into Judas. And so there is a sense where we could say, well, the devil made him do it. Is the devil to blame as well? And I think that can be part of it, but in the same way that we don't look at the awful atrocities done by Hitler and Stalin and these people who've done these awful things who say, oh, I should be let off because the devil made me do it. No, they can't be exonerated. They are still responsible. And Jesus seems to know that as well, because he offered Judas the opportunity to walk away from this when he offered him the bread. In the end, Judas couldn't let go of money and wealth, so he sought out Caiaphas and the religious leaders and received payment to hand Jesus over to them and sealed the deal of betrayal with a kiss. There's a Spider-Man meme, I don't know if you've seen it, where there's a whole heap of different Spideys and they're pointing fingers at each other, or fingers at each other. There's this whole sense of trying to apportion blame away from us onto others. Who's responsible? You. And in the Gospels, we can see that Pilate and the soldiers, we can see Caiaphas and the Jewish crowd, and we can see Judas Iscariot as people where the finger is pointed firmly at them, but there's one more finger. There's one more finger. The clue is found in John chapter 10, where Jesus says, I lay down my life. No one takes it from me. I lay it down on my own accord. The reason why Jesus surrendered to the cruelty of crucifixion was because it was purposed by God from the beginning. There's a very smart guy, smarter than me, Octavius Winslow, who captures it well, and he says, who delivered Jesus up to die? Not Judas for money, not Pilate for fear, not the Jews for envy, but the Father for love. The divine purpose of God is revealed on Good Friday. Because on one hand, you've got human evil condemning and killing Jesus out of envy and hatred. And on the other hand, you've got the gospel plan commenced since the beginning of time to redeem humanity through God's Son. All of this to take away the sins of the world. Friends, the last finger needs to be pointed at you and me. It was Jesus who took away the sins of Pilate, of Caiaphas, of Judas, and yours. There were multiple times Jesus could have avoided this in the Garden of Gethsemane when Peter rebuked him at the temptation, but instead he deliberately went to the cross. He took the punishment of all the Hitlers and all the Stalins and yours. There's no one good. The only person who was good was crucified on this day 2,000 years ago, undeserved, to take away our bad. This was God's plan from the beginning and written approximately 500 years ago before Good Friday. It was even as part of the Jewish scriptures. Isaiah 53 captures this perfectly.
Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering, and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. Yet who of his generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of many people he was punished. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death and was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors.
Thanks, Phil. Good Friday is good because God's good plan was to crush his son, to take away the sins of the world, where Jesus could honestly say, once and for all, it is finished. We're going to finish with communion together as a community of faith, and we're going to receive our communion pieces. When you have the bread in a minute, I want you to consider the fact that Good Friday is in your place, that you're as responsible for the death of Jesus as anyone, that Good Friday is good for us because he received our sin. And so as you hold that piece of bread that was broken for you, and as you eat on it, reflect on how Jesus was despised and rejected, how his suffering received our pain and transgressions. Reflect on how this Good Friday, how he was pierced for your sin and for your struggle, and by how his wounds you are healed. That we're all the same. We are all rebellious and we've all gone astray. But rather than the punishment that we deserve landing on Pilate, on Caiaphas, on Judas, and on us, it went on Jesus, the iniquity of us all. During this song, I'm going to encourage you to just have the bread and eat it and reflect on what makes Friday good for you. At the end, I'll come and lead us in drinking the juice together.